Forgetting can be defined as the absence of memory, a failure to remember some information. The concept of forgetting always makes me think of looking at a picture of myself fishing with my grandfather when I was 3 or 4 years old. I recognize that it's me in the photo. I recognize the place where the photo was taken, but I have no memory of the experience. Now, I'm confident that the picture is real, that I had the sensory experiences of someone fishing with their grandfather. Why don't I have that memory? Where did that information go? This session is about forgetting. This course is aimed at teaching you about how human memory works and about how you can use that information to enhance the accuracy and detail of your own memory. It's worth noting that we could state these same goals from the opposite direction. Forgetting is, in essence, a failure of the memory system. If we understand how to reduce forgetting, then we will know how to improve memory. If you ever study for exams or know someone who does, this session is an important one. In terms of tips about how to commit things to memory as part of taking a course in school, this session will have some very directly useful information. I often talk with students who've spent many, many hours studying something, only to get back disappointing scores on an exam. This session will cover how those people could have learned much more in much less time by matching their study schedules to the characteristics of their human brain. I'm going to start today by discussing something called the Ebbinghaus forgetting function, named for an early psychologist named Hermann Ebbinghaus. Ebbinghaus, like most people, noticed that we tend to forget things. He wondered if this forgetting was governed by any specific principles or laws. Ebbinghaus did his research in the late 1800s and early 1900s, when cognitive science just didn't exist as a discipline yet. Science was being used to study a lot of different things like physics and chemistry and biology, but the idea of applying science to people was still a very new idea. His primary research subject was himself. Ebbinghaus generated an enormous library of 3-letter nonsense syllables. He would then randomly pick out some set of these syllables and attempt to memorize them. His thinking here was that if he'd used actual words instead of these nonsense syllables, then he would have to deal with the interaction between knowledge and memory. By using random letter trigrams, he called them, he aimed to study memory without that interaction, like studying memory in isolation, separate from the processes associated with existing knowledge. Having watched the first 3 sessions of this course, I hope you know this was actually a bit of a bad experimental choice. Memory for most real-world information is inherently related to your existing knowledge. One might even argue that the very way that we remember new things is by linking those new things with other things that we already know. It's much harder to get an experimental handle on existing knowledge, to, say, experimentally control it, because it varies so much from person to person. But to throw this out throws out a whole bunch of important aspects of memory. Nonetheless, Ebbinghaus discovered 2 different principles that do seem to apply to human memory in general, not just to memory for 3-letter nonsense syllables, but to almost everything that's ever been studied. Ebbinghaus had an enormous effect on the study of memory. In a way, all of the memory studies that have come since have been greatly affected by the scientific rigor that he applied to this topic. Ebbinghaus used a lot of different methods, but the most basic involved selecting some number of these random 3-letter nonsense syllables, the trigrams, and then memorizing them. He would run through the list and then test his memory for them. He would repeat this process over and over until he reached some criterion of performance. So, for instance, a typical one is he might repeat until he could correctly recall the whole list correctly 2 times in a row. This first phase of any study was referred to as the learning phase. As soon as he was finished with the learning phase, he entered into a forgetting phase. All that was involved here was waiting for some time. After that forgetting time, Ebbinghaus would then test himself again and see how many of the trigrams he could still remember. Pretty simple stuff so far, right? The genius of Ebbinghaus' work was how carefully he varied how much he studied, how long he waited, and also just the sheer amount of data he collected and analyzed. One of the first things he discovered is that forgetting is not a linear process. We don't forget an equal amount of information across every hour. In fact, most of the forgetting that's going to take place after you've studied something happens relatively quickly, right after you've finished studying. An initial period of rapid information loss. After that period, the rate of forgetting drops and eventually levels off. When Ebbinghaus plotted all of his data, a logarithmic curve emerged. The amount of information retained follows a very predictable function, one that's subject to a law of diminishing returns. In retrospect, I suppose this shouldn't have been so surprising. The more you've forgotten, the less you have left to forget, and so the slower the forgetting takes place. What's surprising here is just how consistent this function is. If you learn the material better, that is, if you study it more, you will forget more slowly, but the shape of the function will be the same. It might be stretched to the right, reflecting slower forgetting, but still that same basic logarithmic shape will emerge. This works with random lists of trigrams, but it also works with vocabulary words, pictures, movies, even calculus. This Ebbinghaus forgetting function seems to describe something very fundamental about how the human brain encodes and then slowly loses information. Many researchers have proposed that this curve describes a general decay process that happens within the human memory for any information. When you learn something new, whenever you experience things that you will later remember, it's because there are structural changes made to the pattern of connections in your brain. This network of hundreds of millions of neurons and trillions of synaptic connections between those neurons is always changing. When new experiences come in through your eyes, ears, and other senses, the pattern of neuronal activation can be compared to patterns of activation that were produced in the past. If you recognize an image as something you've seen before, this is a result of comparing the new information to the previously encoded information. Similarly, if you recall some piece of information, say the atomic weight of helium or the name of the capital of France, you are somehow reading that information out of the pattern of activity in your own brain. This pattern of activity results from stimulation from some areas of your brain, perhaps the areas that become active when you think of the words capital and France, and the areas of your brain with information about names. The fact that the term capital of France activates Paris and not London is because of the elegant and precise patterns of connections between the neurons up here in your brain. New experience is encoded by changing the patterns of connectivity. Any single experience might result in slight changes in the strengths of connections between dozens, hundreds, even thousands of different neurons. It's presumed that the complexity involved in getting these connections right is part of the reason that we need to study things repeatedly to get the information encoded in a concrete, reliable fashion. Now, these neurons in your brain are physical cells. Sometimes they die off, sometimes they get fatigued. The strength of their connections is subject to a fair amount of random variation over time. The more time that passes, the more the neuronal networks in your brain will change in what is essentially a random fashion. These random changes are thought to produce a slow, consistent decay in the information stored in our long-term memories. It's thought to be responsible for the consistent pattern of decline associated with the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. Ebbinghaus wasn't finished at this point, however. So far I've described how he memorized those trigrams till he reached a criterion, then waited for some period of time, that forgetting phase, and then tested his memory. That's where these initial forgetting curves emerged. The next thing Ebbinghaus would do is study his chosen set of trigrams again, until he reached that memorization criterion again. The first thing Ebbinghaus noted was that there is a tremendous savings in the relearning time. That's obvious, I think, for the cases where he had only waited a short time and forgotten almost nothing. But consider the situation where he waited for a long time, maybe a few days, until he had forgotten half of the trigrams on his list. You might think he would need about half as much time to relearn the ones that he'd forgotten. That's not the case, however. When he restudied, even when he couldn't recall most of the list, a very brief additional study time would push him back up to that criterion level. This is referred to as a savings in relearning. And like the forgetting curves, it seems to be a near universal in terms of human memory. Researchers have tried this with material ranging from math and language learning to poetry memorization. If you've learned something in the past, even if you feel as if you've all but completely forgotten it, traces of that memory are still present up there in your brain. And with a little refreshing, those traces can be greatly bolstered in strength. Ebbinghaus discovered one more really important and fascinating thing with these experiments. With some of the studies, he would learn the trigrams, then forget the trigrams, then relearn the trigrams, and then, here's the new thing here, track the forgetting that took place after the relearning. The forgetting process still took place, of course. Just because you've studied something twice doesn't make it stick perfectly in your memory forever. But the forgetting took place more slowly. In some cases, really significantly more slowly. And if you repeat this whole process, wait for some forgetting to take place, and then study it again a third time, a fourth time, and more, now the forgetting could be really, really slow. I think every student should be taught this as early as they are capable of understanding it, maybe even in the 3rd or 4th grade. Certainly kids should be taught this as soon as they reach any stage of their education where they're being asked to memorize anything. If you want to be a good learner, you should really be given some sort of a user's manual, some instructions on using it, right? The reason these particular experiments are so important, however, is that there are some inherent studying guidelines here. There's information not just about how to study, but specifically when to study. Say you want to learn some new set of information. Could be anything. A memorized poem, a list of presidents, anything really. Let's use the example of memorizing a list of the countries in the European Union. There are 27 countries there, alphabetically from Austria to the United Kingdom. The first thing you need to do is read over the list and then start practicing recalling it from memory. This would be a hard task, of course, probably one that should inspire a consideration of other aspects of learning and memory, but let's just focus on timing for the moment. Imagine then that you have succeeded in memorizing the list. At least 2 times you've managed to list all of those countries in Europe: Austria, Belgium, Bulgaria, Cyprus, etc., 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 Spain, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. Time to take a break and do something else. Now, as you're doing something else, this memory will begin to fade. Within a short period of time, you will have started losing a few countries here and there. Since you've just learned this list for the first time, we're in the steepest part of that Ebbinghaus forgetting function. If you want to remember the list perfectly later on, there's only one solution: study it again. Probably within about an hour of that initial learning, it would be a good idea to test yourself again. Almost certainly you'll make a few mistakes, but you can correct them, refresh your memory, and within a few rounds of practice, you'll be again back to that level of perfection. Note that this second study session will probably be a quick one, since, as Ebbinghaus first discovered, the relearning process is much faster than the initial learning. Okay, time to do something else again. The forgetting will start happening again, of course, but it will happen more slowly. This time, rather than studying again after an hour, probably 2 or 3 hours of forgetting time is more appropriate. Again, the information will get relearned even more quickly, and the subsequent forgetting will be even slower. For the next cycle of this process, you can probably double the time again to about 6 hours. Maybe now you're into the next day, when you even more quickly relearn your way to perfection. The next cycle can probably wait for 12 hours, maybe right before bed the next day. The next study session can be after 24 hours, then 48 hours, then 96. I should note that all of these study sessions are intended to be relatively brief. By the 5th or 6th session, we're talking about spending just a few minutes probably. I'm describing what might seem like a lot of studying, but when you add it all up, it might only be about an hour over the course of a week of studying. And I should emphasize here that the result is a very durable and essentially perfectly accurate encoding. It's worth contrasting this with the study habits that I see with many of my undergraduate students. Most of whom have never heard of Ebbinghaus, I should say, when they arrive in my classroom. Most students read their textbook before coming to class. Okay, some of them read their textbooks before coming to class. They then listen to the session and participate in the discussions. For the majority of students, unless I've given them some assignment to force them to do otherwise, they then put away their notes in that particular section of the text until the night before the exam. For some of these students, the study sessions the night before can be truly epic, Herculean all-night endeavors. It's not that these students lack commitment or devotion to the goal of learning the material and getting a good grade in the class. The problem is that they invest their study time inefficiently, really horribly inefficiently. If they just learn to take those hours of exam night studying and spread them out over the course of the semester, they can remember more, much, much more, with the same amount of effort. In most cases, actually, with much less effort. I think it's clear how one might schedule their studying for a course with Ebbinghaus and his forgetting curves in mind. They should review their notes and the text as soon as possible after a class meeting, ideally within an hour or so. They should plan to review it again several hours later, and then a day later, and then 2 days later, and then 4 days, and so on. There are a lot of study sessions here, but as I've mentioned, they're relatively short, and within a few days, very brief. This stuff works. It works really well. Ultimately, of course, the hope isn't just to free up more time for students to spend relaxing, although that's fine too. The real fruit of applying this method is that students can learn more information in more detail with greater accuracy. Undergraduate students can do it, and so can we. Okay, so we've talked about forgetting in general and about how to avoid it with repeated study sessions. I also talked about one theory about why forgetting takes place, decay. I described how memories are stored as changes to the patterns of interconnections between neurons in the brain. That precise pattern breaks down over time, leading to forgetting. But decay isn't the only theory about why forgetting takes place. There are many theories, at least several of which are likely to be correct. I've talked about how memory functions as a series of steps. Let me review those and then talk about some ways in which breakdowns in the processing at those steps can lead to forgetting. So the steps I outlined in session 3 involve 3 stages, right? First, something's perceived and transferred into short-term memory. Second, during the time that the information is in your short-term memory, it's encoded into the more durable long-term memory. And then the final stage, the memory is retrieved from your long-term storage back into short-term or working memory, at which point you're able to use the information, perhaps for answering a question on an exam, deciding where you parked your car, any of 1,000 other tasks. Forgetting, or more specifically a failure of memory, can happen at all 3 of these stages. Let's consider this with an example. Say, remembering where you left your keys last night when you arrived home. I have this problem a lot myself, actually. I've gotten much better at remembering it, however. I'll tell you at least 2 good techniques for remembering things like this after we consider how we fail to do so at times. So the first stage in any memory is perceiving the event to be remembered. With the keys, we may think that we've forgotten where we left them, but that presumes that we actually perceived where we left them to begin with. For instance, maybe when I arrived home last night with my keys in my hand, I was met by my beautiful daughter, who eagerly ran up to give me a hug. This is a wonderful thing, actually, far more important than where my keys ever are. So understandably, I pick her up, swing her around, and ask her how her day was. If I'm lucky, she has some stories to tell me, maybe something to show me in her room. In the midst of all that, she might hand me a piece of paper with a drawing on it. I set my keys down in order to take the paper and then devote my attention to the drawing and our discussion about it. At some point, we move on to another room and voila, my keys are left behind. The next morning, as I hurry around the house looking desperately for those keys, I'll be kicking myself for forgetting where I left them. In a sense, I have forgotten, but I really never had a chance in this situation. You can't remember something that you never perceived. This type of forgetting is usually referred to as a failure to encode a memory. The heart of the problem is the difference between our belief that we should have a memory of something and the reality of the situation. Failure to encode errors often arise when people talk about errors by eyewitnesses, for instance. Failures by eyewitnesses to identify perpetrators of crimes, for instance, at an armed robbery. As soon as the robber pulls out a gun, people are understandably drawn to focus their attention on it. So much of their looking and thinking is aimed at the gun that witnesses may never actually look at the face of the armed robber. Many hours later, when a police detective is asking the witness to describe the face of the robber, they may try, but will often be very inaccurate. They'll feel as if they should remember the face. How could they not? But it's not their fault. They just failed to perceive it in the first place. Okay, so that's forgetting at the first stage of the memory process. How about that second stage, in which we transfer things from short-term memory into long-term memory? It's pretty easy to think of examples here where a failure could occur. I put my keys down on the table next to my bed and think to myself, remember the keys, remember the keys, remember the keys. I maybe say it out loud 3 times like that. I had the information in my short-term memory, but it never made it to my long-term memory. As soon as my attention turned to something else, it faded from my short-term memory and was gone. Okay, so imagine I did encode the information about my keys in my memory well, into my long-term memory. I perceived the location of the keys. I thought of some way to relate that location to things that I already know. Maybe I even generated some sort of a good image the way we've talked about. Maybe I imagined giant keys sitting on my pillow, tucked into bed, saying, the key to happiness is a good night's sleep. So I'm all ready to recall the key location tomorrow morning, but still there's a chance I might forget. How? We've already talked about the process of decay in the context of the Ebbinghaus forgetting function. The specific changes in the neuronal networks of my brain might have decayed over the course of the night such that I will fail to remember the key location. That's unlikely, actually, given the short amount of time, but there are 2 other types of errors that can lead to a failure to retrieve information, even after it's been encoded properly in my long-term memory. The first is called retroactive interference. That is, when you learn new things, those new things can interfere with the information that you've learned in the past. My favorite example of this is when you try to remember the phone number of a house where you used to live. You might have remembered that phone number for years and recalled it many, many times. But once you move to a new house and learn the new phone number that goes with the new address, that information seems to overwrite, in a way, that old original information. The human brain represents information in an associative fashion. We recall information by having a cue that connects with it. If I ask for home phone number, you have a strong association to your current number. When you move from one house to another, that associative connection gets remade to the new number. So learning new information can impact your memory for older information, can impact your ability to retrieve it. With my key remembering example, I can imagine how this might apply. Perhaps my wife talked to me about the location of her keys and asked me to help remember them. So I mentally made the association of key location to bowl on the kitchen counter where her keys were. It's possible that this new association will compete with or completely block my existing association between key location and bedside table where I left them. That would be retroactive interference. Proactive interference is a little more complicated to describe in the abstract, but I think it's the most likely culprit here if I forget where my keys are. The basic idea of proactive interference is that information you've learned in the past can interfere with the learning of new information in the future. There are many examples of this from everyday learning. There's good evidence, for instance, that college students retain more of the information they learn from their first-year classes than from their second and third-year classes. Something about the new context of college seems to provide a new wave of fresh associative connections. As they learn more and more in college, however, that existing knowledge seems to interfere with the acquisition of additional knowledge, as the location-based associations have to be spread more and more thinly. With my keys, if I forget where they are in the morning, proactive interference is the most likely culprit. I've encoded where I left them on one particular evening, But I've also done that dozens, hundreds of other times, using different locations. The concept of key location is associated already with kitchen tables, counters, coat pockets, work bags, and many other locations, even the lock of the front door itself. The learning of those associations in the past makes it extra hard to learn a new association. That's proactive interference. All of this leads to what is a really simple way of remembering where your keys are. Always put them in the same place. For instance, a hook or tray near your front door. In this case, the interference of prior memories will actually become a benefit as you repeatedly encode the same location for your keys. There's one other phenomenon of forgetting that's worth discussing here, called the tip of the tongue phenomenon. It's related to retroactive and proactive interference, perhaps even caused by it, but it's a particular type of forgetting that's specifically associated with a failure to retrieve information in that third stage. The very salient part of the tip of the tongue phenomenon is that you can't recall some piece of information, but you feel very strongly that you do know it. It seems to be there in your head. It's like it's just out of reach. It feels as if you can almost say the answer to the memory question you have, but just not quite. Colloquially, this is described as having something on the tip of your tongue. Several researchers have explored this phenomenon and found evidence that it's quite real. First, the participants essentially never experience this phenomenon for information they haven't learned. They do every so often, but it's very, very rare, extremely rare. Second, for facts that were reported as being on the tip of their tongues, participants are likely to be able to recall that information eventually, after some delay. So if you think you know something, even if you know that you can't recall it at the moment, there's a pretty good chance that the information is up there and that it will eventually be retrievable. So what should we do in that situation? How can you get around one of these failure to retrieve mental blocks? One of the best things to do actually is that just wait. Think about something else. When you return to the question a few minutes later, the new mental set that you've created may enable you to access that information. So with all of this in mind, how should we remember things like where we put our keys, our medicine bottles, our books, other things? Are there good ways we can apply our knowledge of what human memory is good at to enhance our memory performance here? My favorite tip here is to enhance the encoding of the location of your keys, or whatever the other item is, with a good mental image at the time you set them down. My keys, my key ring, has always looked to me a bit like a flower, with the keys forming the petals and the ring the center. As I set them down somewhere, especially if I'm concerned about remembering where they are in the future, I like to think of it as planting a flower in that location. In my vivid mental image here, the flower grows while I'm away, lifting up on a long, stout stem and leaning towards the nearest sunny window. The human brain is good at locations and images, right? If you develop your own key image, I can't promise you will never lose your keys again, but I can assure you that you'll lose them less often, especially on occasions when you take the time to perceive and encode their location. This session has been about forgetting, failures to encode, decay, retroactive interference, and proactive interference. We also talked about some of the timing of the forgetting process, as first studied by Hermann Ebbinghaus, and the way to schedule study time around those timing characteristics. This session is very much the sort of story that I hope to convey with this course. As you get to know the operating characteristics of this information processor that you have between your ears, both the strengths and limitations of that information processor, you can make better and better use of it. Hopefully your memories about forgetting will help you to forget future memories less. I'll see you next time.